The Gilded Serpent was New York's most dangerous dining room, and it was dead silent. A dropped spoon would have echoed like a gunshot. Every eye was fixed on Table 1, the domain of Kieran Thorne, the most feared man on the East Coast. Power like his could protect you from anything except the terrified screams of your own daughter. The 7-year-old's cries paralyzed the room. Nannies quit, specialists failed. 17 different experts in 5 years gave up. His beautiful fiancée, Vivian Ashford, was making it worse, her sharp nails digging into the girl's arm. Then a waitress moved. She had cheap shoes, a stained apron, and the empty eyes of someone who knew real suffering. She did not plead or bow to the king of the city. She did something that stopped him cold, and you will want to see what happened next. But this waitress carried a secret, one tied directly to Kieran Thorne's criminal empire. It was a truth that could either save them or burn everything to the ground. If you enjoy stories of revenge and impossible choices, please share this and subscribe so you do not miss the conclusion. This story will show you a powerful truth. Sometimes the person with nothing left to lose is the only one brave enough to change everything. It is about how one small act of kindness from a broken woman saved a broken man and his broken daughter. If you believe that family is not about blood, but about who stays when the world gets too loud, hit that like button right now and stay until the very end, because this ending will surprise you. Now, let us go back a few hours to understand the woman with the empty eyes. Before we see what she did, we have to go back a few hours. We need to understand Cassandra Mora and the darkness she carried in her eyes. Working at the Gilded Serpent was a dance with death. For Cass, it was another night of avoiding wandering hands and carrying burning plates while ignoring the insults of powerful men. She straightened her worn apron. She had to finish this shift. Her landlord, Mr. Novak, had been very clear. If the rent was not in his hand by Friday, she and her brother were going to be on the street. Cassandra Morrow was not supposed to have a life like this. 18 years ago, when she was just 10, everything was different. Her father, Thomas Morrow, was a good cop, one of the few who couldn't be bought. One night, he refused a huge payout from a local gang. They found his body in an alley 3 days later with 3 holes in his chest. Cass could still hear her mother's shriek when the police came to their door. She remembered her mother falling to the floor, holding her father's coat for 3 days straight. 3 months later, her mother's heart gave out. The official cause was poor health, but Cass knew better. She died from grief, unable to live in a world without the man she loved. At 10 years old, Cassandra became an orphan, responsible for her 1-year-old brother, Theo, at St. Matthew's orphanage. Those years were a special kind of hell. Cass defended Theo from older boys and from guards who used leather belts to teach lessons. She suffered 2 broken ribs for smuggling bread to her brother. They locked her in a pitch-black basement for 3 days for talking back. But she never let them see her cry. She learned to swallow her pain, to read people, and to survive in a world that wanted her gone. At 28, Cass thought she had finally left that hell behind. But fate wasn't finished. Theo, the boy she had protected her whole life, was diagnosed with a critical heart defect. The surgery he needed cost $250,000, and no insurance would help. For 8 years, Cass worked like a machine at 3 different jobs. She served tables all day, washed dishes all night, and cleaned hospitals on weekends. She managed to save $80,000. But 6 months ago, the man she loved, the man she planned to marry, disappeared with every last cent. He left a single note on her pillow that said, "Sorry, business is business." Cass did not weep when she found the note. She had forgotten how. She just crumpled the paper, threw it away, and went to work her night shift. But something inside her turned to stone. That morning, before her shift, she visited Theo in the hospital. He was so thin and pale, but he still managed a weak smile for her. "Do you have enough money yet?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Almost," Cass lied, the smile on her face an empty mask. "Just a little longer." She didn't tell him the doctor had pulled her aside to say they were out of time. She didn't tell him that in 1 month, his heart would fail for good. She just squeezed his hand, promised to return the next day, and left the hospital carrying an impossible weight. Now she was standing here, in this den of killers, watching a 7-year-old girl scream a pain that nobody could see. She saw the cruel woman's nails digging into that small arm. She saw the most powerful man in the city standing there, completely helpless to save his own child, and a fire ignited in her soul. 18 years of protecting Theo had forged one rule in her mind: act now, be afraid later. She did not consider the danger. She did not worry about her job. She saw a child in agony, and she knew what to do. Cass grabbed a thick linen napkin from a service counter. She did not ask for permission. She walked directly to the lighting panel by the kitchen and turned the lights down by half. The room was instantly softer, bathed in a dim glow. A few men looked up, annoyed, but they kept silent. In their world, asking questions was a fatal mistake. Then Cass walked to table 1. "Get away from her!" Vivian snapped, her eyes cold. Cass paid her no attention. She even ignored the stare of Kieran Thorne, a man who could erase her from existence with a single word. She knelt on the marble floor next to the screaming girl. She didn't touch Maisie or speak to her. Instead, she draped the heavy napkin over her own head, creating a small, private tent. Then she just sat, cross-legged, perfectly still in the middle of the chaos. The entire room stopped breathing. Nobody could understand her actions. Vivian's mouth hung open, speechless. Kieran Thorne was frozen, his intense gray eyes locked on this bizarre spectacle. Then, a miracle. Maisie's screams began to fade. She stopped fighting. Her tear-filled eyes, no longer wild with panic, focused on the strange woman under the white cloth. The sheer strangeness of it all broke through her terror. Her mind was no longer overwhelmed by the noise and light. It was focused on this puzzle. Cass slowly lifted a corner of the napkin. She did not smile. She just held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. Then she let the cloth drop, vanishing again inside her makeshift fort. Maisie stared. The lights were low. The room was quiet. The scary woman with the sharp fingernails was gone. And on the floor was this stranger, safe in a little house. She was not a threat. She was not yelling. Maisie began to crawl toward her slowly, like a cautious animal. Kieran Thorne, a man who had seen unspeakable violence and heard desperate pleas, held his breath watching his daughter inch her way toward a waitress. Maisie reached the napkin tent. Her small hand shook as she lifted the edge. Cass met her gaze. In a voice so quiet only Maisie could hear, she said, "The world is too loud sometimes, isn't it? It is okay to hide." Maisie's little lip trembled as she nodded. It was a tiny gesture that held a mountain of trust. "I have a secret base," Cass whispered, lifting the cloth higher. "It is quiet in here." Maisie crawled right in. The whole room watched as the daughter of the East Coast's most powerful gangster disappeared under a napkin with a penniless waitress. For 30 seconds they sat together. The Mafia princess and the city's poorest servant, curled up under a piece of white linen on the floor of New York's most exclusive criminal restaurant. The screaming was gone. All that remained was the sound of Maisie's soft breathing and the pounding of Cass's own heart. Inside their tent, Maisie looked at Cass, her eyes calm. She didn't have to speak. For the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. Cass gently lowered the cloth. Maisie sat beside her, perfectly peaceful. Cass stood, smoothed her stained apron, and looked directly at Kieran Thorne. She did not lower her eyes. She did not shake. Her voice was steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "She has sensory processing disorder. The noise overloaded her system. Her sensory system. Touching her was like setting her skin on fire. She needed a reset." Cass then faced Vivian. The beautiful woman's face was a mask of red fury and shame. Maisie's skin was still under her fingernails. Cass met her gaze and spoke with a cold calm. "Never grab a child who is panicking. It teaches them that they have to fight for safety." Without waiting for a reply, Cass walked toward the kitchen. Her spine was straight, her pace was even. She never looked back. The silence hung in the air for 5 more seconds. Then, a single person in the restaurant began to clap. A second person joined. The applause died quickly under Vivian's frozen stare. But it was too late. In front of New York's most powerful underworld figures, a waitress with frayed shoes did what experts could not. The balance of power at table 1 had just changed. Kieran Thorne could not look away from his daughter. Usually, a meltdown like that would leave Maisie in a catatonic state for days. She would stop eating, stop speaking, and refuse all contact. Her doctors described it as a recovery phase. Kieran saw it as hell, watching his daughter exist like a breathing doll while he could do nothing. But now, Maisie was eating. She carefully wrapped pasta around her fork and lifted it to her mouth. She even pointed to a painting on the wall, whispering to the worn doll she always held. It was a miracle. Nothing else described it. In 5 years, 17 nannies and 9 psychologists had failed, yet a waitress in worn shoes fixed it in 30 seconds with a napkin. Kieran looked at Vivian. She was typing furiously on her phone, desperately trying to manage the story. Her perfect features were twisted by rage. The control she valued so much had been broken by an unknown waitress. Kieran said, "Nothing." He summoned Pritchard, the restaurant manager, who was trembling in a corner. "Who is that waitress?" Kieran's voice was a low rumble. Pritchard swallowed hard. "A temp, sir. Cassandra Morrow. She started 3 months ago. I am so sorry for her disrespect. I will fire her for speaking to your guest that way." Kieran tilted his head. The small motion made all the color drain from Pritchard's face. "If you fire her," Kieran said, each word a heavy stone, "I will buy this restaurant and throw you out before the sun rises. You know I am not joking." Pritchard almost fell. "Yes, sir. I understand. Bring her to the back VIP room when we are done." Pritchard nodded like a puppet and rushed off. The rest of the dinner was silent and tense. Vivian made several attempts to talk, but Kieran ignored her. His thoughts were on the kitchen door where the waitress went, and on the eyes that did not flinch from his. He thought about how she spoke to Maisie like a person, not a problem. 45 minutes later, Kieran was alone in the VIP room. Vivian had taken Maisie home, and he knew she was furious. He did not care. The door opened and Cassandra Morrow entered. She did not lower her head or shrink away. She stood tall, looking him in the eye as if he were any other customer. "Sit," Kieran said, gesturing to the chair. Cass sat down, her hands resting calmly on her lap. She waited. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "I do. And you still meet my gaze? Should I look somewhere else?" Kieran almost smiled. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with such nerve. "What do you know about sensory processing disorder?" he asked. "Enough to know it when I see it." "How?" Cass hesitated for a moment. "My brother. He had similar issues when he was young. I learned how to help." "How is your brother?" "He is in the hospital. He has a heart condition." Kieran nodded, storing the information. "You are not afraid of me." It was a statement, not a question. Cass met his gray eyes. "I have seen things far more frightening than you, Mr. Thorne." She paused as if catching herself. "I am sorry. I did not mean—" "It is true," Kieran cut in, a hint of respect in his voice. "You are the first person in 5 years to look at me without shaking." Cass remained silent. She sat there with perfect patience, facing the most feared man on the East Coast. Kieran studied her. He saw the worn shoes, the stained apron, and the shadows in her eyes from a life of hardship. But there was no weakness there, only resilience. "I have an offer for you," Kieran finally said. "But not now. Someone will contact you." Cass got to her feet. "Can I go?" "You can." She walked to the door but paused before opening it. "Your daughter," Cass said, her back still to him. "She is not broken. She just feels the world in a different way. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." Then she left, leaving Kieran Thorne alone in the room. For the first time in years, he felt a small crack of light in his endless darkness. 3 days after their meeting, Kieran Thorne was in his office at Thorne Tower. From the 63rd floor of his Manhattan skyscraper, the city looked like a chessboard. But he was not looking at the view. He was focused on the thick file on his desk. Declan Byrne, his most trusted man, stood before him. Declan had been with Kieran from the beginning, a loyal soldier who had killed and nearly died for the Empire. He was one of the very few people Kieran trusted completely. "This is what we found on her, boss," Declan said. Kieran opened the file. The first page was a picture of Cassandra Morrow, taken as she left a hospital. Her shoulders were slumped from exhaustion, but her walk was steady. He started to read. With every page, his expression grew colder. Father Thomas Morrow, a police officer, was killed when Cassandra was 10. The official report called it an unsolved cold case. But Kieran knew who was responsible. Salvatore Vega. The name made Kieran's jaw tighten. Vega was his biggest rival, a snake who had tried to destroy the Thorne Empire many times. 18 years ago, Vega had a good cop killed for refusing a bribe. That cop was Cassandra's father. Kieran continued reading. Her mother, Sarah Morrow, died from a heart attack 3 months after her husband was murdered. Cassandra was sent to St. Matthew's orphanage. Her records mentioned violence but gave no details. Medical files showed 3 hospital visits in 7 years for broken ribs, severe bruises, and head trauma. Kieran had witnessed and done horrible things, but the thought of a 10-year-old girl being beaten in an orphanage filled him with a cold rage. Her present life was just as hard. She worked 3 jobs, was 2 months late on rent, and her bank account was empty. A man named Marcus Webb had scammed her out of $80,000 and then vanished. Kieran committed the name to memory. Marcus Webb would be found. He turned to the file on Theo Morrow. Her brother was 19, a brilliant computer engineering student at Columbia. He had a 3.9 grade point average, but he also had congenital heart disease and needed urgent surgery that cost $250,000. His condition was getting worse every day. On the last page was the photograph. Cassandra sat by Theo's hospital bed, holding his hand. She was smiling, but her eyes had dark circles from exhaustion. Her brother was frail and pale, yet he looked at her with complete trust. Kieran stared at the image for a long time. He remembered how Maisie had looked at the waitress with that same total trust, and the miracle that had occurred in just a few seconds. "She is clean, boss," Declan reported. "No gang ties, no criminal past, no secret agenda. She is just a girl who has had a hard life and is still fighting." Kieran closed the file. He walked to the window and gazed down at the city lights. Cassandra Morrow lost her father to his world. She grew up with pain. She should hate men like him. But instead, she served them every day at the Gilded Serpent, just to earn money to save her brother. He respected her will to survive. "Set up a meeting," he said, his eyes fixed on the city below. "Declan, get her here. I will make an offer she cannot refuse." 2 days later, Cassandra Morrow stood inside Thorne Tower. She fought the urge to stare like a tourist. A cold voice on the phone had summoned her the night before. "Mr. Thorne wants to see you. A car is coming for you at 10. The line went dead. There was no room to argue. Now she was here. The lobby chandelier alone was worth more than her entire life's earnings. A man in a dark suit led her to a private elevator. It climbed to the 63rd floor. When the doors opened, Cass stepped into a penthouse that was bigger than her entire apartment building. Huge windows showed all of Manhattan. The furniture was simple, but each piece screamed of impossible wealth. An abstract painting on the wall was probably worth more than what Theo needed for his surgery. Kieran Thorne had his back to her, looking out the window. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up. A long scar ran down his powerful forearm. He turned around. His gray eyes scanned her like she was a business deal. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to a black leather sofa. Cass sat with a straight back, her hands flat on her legs. She met his stare. "I will be direct," Kieran said from the opposite chair. "I have a proposal for you. Hear me out completely." Cass just nodded. "My daughter Maisie needs someone who can connect with her. I have hired 17 nannies in 5 years. They all quit. I hired 9 psychologists with impressive degrees. None of them accomplished what you did in 30 seconds." She remained silent, listening. "I want you to be Maisie's live-in nanny. The salary is $20,000 a month. All expenses are paid. You will have your own room, a car, and anything else you require." Cass felt like she had been punched in the gut. $20,000 a month. It was more than 10 times what she made working 3 jobs. But she knew a man like this offered nothing for free. "What is the catch?" she asked. Kieran's eyes flickered with something that might have been respect. "I will cover the entire cost of your brother's surgery, $250,000. The money will be at the hospital tomorrow if you accept." The world seemed to stop for Cass. She could not breathe or think. $250,000. He offered her Theo's life like it was pocket change. "Why?" she asked, her voice tight. "You have no idea who I am. You do not owe me anything. Why would you do this?" "Because no one in 5 years has treated my daughter like a child. They saw her as a problem, something broken that needed fixing. You were the first person to sit with her on the floor and tell her it was okay to hide." Kieran rose and walked to the window. "I am not a good man, Cassandra. The things I have done would make you sick, but I will pay any price for Maisie." Cass stared at his back, her mind racing. "That is not everything, is it?" she said. "You mentioned conditions." Kieran faced her again. For the first time, she saw a hint of doubt in his expression. "My world demands certain appearances," he said slowly. "My council consists of old men. They think power requires a stable family. They expect me to marry Vivian Ashford to secure an alliance, but I do not trust her." Cass just waited. "I have to investigate Vivian without making her suspicious. To do that, I need an excuse to delay the wedding." He looked directly at her. "To my council and to the world, you will be my wife." "What?" Cass shot to her feet. "A paper marriage," he clarified. "Nothing physical. You will have your own room and your own life. I will not touch you. But in public, you will be Mrs. Thorne." "You are crazy," Cass said, backing away. "I cannot pretend to be a mafia boss's wife. That is not my world." "6 months," Kieran said. "Just for 6 months. When it is over, I will give you $1 million on top of your salary. You and your brother can start a new life. You will never have to worry about money again." Cass paced around the room. This was insane. She could not do it. The Mafia had killed her father. She promised herself she would never get involved. But then she pictured Theo. She saw the hope in his eyes. She heard the doctor's warning that they were out of time. She heard the beep of the hospital monitor. Time was running out. "What if someone discovers the truth?" she asked. "I will keep you safe," Kieran said, moving closer. "No one harms what belongs to me. Once you sign that contract, you are mine." Cass looked into his steel-gray eyes. She thought about her father, who died fighting this world. She thought of her mother, who died from a broken heart. And she thought of Theo, who needed a miracle. Sometimes you have to walk through hell to save the people you love. "All right," Cass said. Her voice was surprisingly firm. "I will do it." 3 days later, Cassandra Morrow arrived at Thorn Tower with one small suitcase. It held everything she owned. The suitcase looked ridiculous in a bedroom that was 3 times bigger than her old apartment. Her new room was in the East Wing. It had glass walls that looked out over the Hudson River. The private bathroom had a marble tub larger than her old bed. The walk-in closet was completely empty. Cass opened her suitcase and looked at her few worn-out clothes. She laughed a dry, humorless laugh. All of her belongings would barely fill one drawer. A maid named Helena knocked and asked if she needed help. Cass did not know what to say. She had never had a maid. She had never seen gold faucets on a sink. She had never felt sheets made of expensive Egyptian silk. She thanked Helena and said she was fine. Then she shut the door and sat on the bed, just trying to breathe. She was in the lion's den now. There was no going back. Later, Declan showed her around the penthouse. It had 12 rooms. There was a private gym, a small movie theater, a library with thousands of books, and a rooftop garden with a pool. Maisie's room was in the west wing, far from hers. Declan stopped outside a white door that had flowers painted on it. "She is in there," he said quietly. "She does not like strangers, noise, or being touched. Most of the time, she ignores everyone." Cass nodded. "I know the boss expects a lot from you," Declan said, his eyes hard to read. "Do not let him down." He walked away, leaving Cass alone in front of the white door. She took a deep breath before she opened it. Maisie's room looked like a fairy tale. The walls were pale blue with white clouds. The bed was shaped like a castle. Shelves were full of books and dolls. But Maisie was not in her bed or on a chair. She was huddled in the room's dimmest corner, holding a worn cloth doll and staring at nothing. Cass remained silent. She offered no greeting. She made no move to approach. Instead, she crossed to the opposite corner, a dozen feet away, and settled on the floor. From her bag, she pulled a ball of yarn and 2 knitting needles. Then she started to knit. The first loop, the second, the third. The gentle clicking of the needles sounded like soft rain on a rooftop. Cass never glanced at Maisie. She did not expect any response. She simply sat, knitting, as if it were the most ordinary activity in the world. 18 years raising Theo had taught her a vital lesson. Wounded children do not need someone rushing in with promises and hugs. Betrayal has taught them not to trust such things. They need someone patient enough to wait, wise enough not to push, and constant enough to prove they will not leave. So Cass did not speak to Maisie that first day. She simply knitted in her corner from 3 o'clock until 6, when a maid came to get Maisie for dinner. The little girl got up, her eyes still avoiding Cass, and left as though the room were empty. Cass was not discouraged. She understood this was a long fight, and she was a survivor. She could be patient. The next day, Cass came back to the same corner and resumed her knitting. Maisie still paid her no mind. The third day passed the same way. On the fourth day, Cass saw that Maisie had shifted closer, maybe only 2 feet, but it was enough. The fifth day, Cass intentionally let the ball of yarn fall. It rolled across the wood floor, coming to a stop at Maisie's feet. The girl looked from the yarn to Cass and back to the yarn. A minute passed, then another. Finally, Maisie leaned over, picked up the yarn, and carried it back to Cass. "Thank you," Cass said quietly, careful not to look directly into the girl's eyes. "Would you want to learn how to do this?" Maisie gave no answer, but she sat down next to Cass. It was the first real step. The second week brought progress that Cass had not dared to expect. After that first day sitting together, Maisie started to show up in the playroom earlier each afternoon, almost as if she was waiting. Cass maintained her routine. She would arrive, settle in her corner, and begin to knit. She never pushed Maisie to speak. She never asked if she had eaten or slept well, unlike the nannies before her. Cass was just there, a quiet and steady presence, like a beacon in a storm. On the 9th day, Maisie brought a box of colored pencils and a sheaf of paper with her. She did not go to the dark corner anymore. She sat about 3 feet from Cass, arranged her paper on the floor, and began to draw. Cass did not peer at the drawings. She knew that any direct focus might send the girl retreating into her shell. She continued knitting, giving Maisie her space, but remaining close enough to be a comfort. They sat like this for hours, surrounded by the whisper of pencil on paper and the soft click of knitting needles. There was no music or talk, only the shared quiet of two souls learning to build trust. On the 11th day, Cass was struggling with a difficult stitch and had to pause to unravel her mistake. She heard a faint sound of footsteps and looked up. Maisie stood before her, holding a piece of paper in both hands, her gaze fixed on the floor. Cass did not speak. She simply waited. Maisie held the paper out to her. Cass gently accepted the drawing. It was a simple sketch, but its meaning was incredibly clear. Two stick figures stood together, one tall with long black hair, the other small with curly black hair. A large blue umbrella sheltered them. Above, a red dragon was breathing fire, but the flames could not penetrate the umbrella's shield. It kept them safe. Cass felt a lump form in her throat. She knew exactly what it represented. The dragon was the frightening world outside, full of noise and harshness. The umbrella was their quiet space. It was safety. "Who is this?" Cass asked softly, gesturing to the figures, although she already knew the answer. Maisie was quiet for a very long time. Then, in a voice so faint Cass had to lean in to hear, she spoke. "Me," she whispered, pointing to the smaller figure. Then she moved her finger to the taller one. "Sister." Cass felt a sharp, sweet pang in her heart. It was the first time Maisie had given her a name. Not Waitress, not Nanny. Sister. "I love this drawing," Cass said, her voice unsteady despite her best efforts. "Can I keep it?" Maisie gave a small nod, then went back to her spot and continued to draw. But this time, she sat closer. Their shoulders were almost touching. Cass knew she had broken through a barrier that had stood for 5 years. She did not realize someone was watching from the doorway. Kieran Thorne had come home early. He was headed to his office but stopped when he passed Maisie's playroom. He stood unseen, watching through the crack in the door. He saw his daughter, who had spoken only to a doll for 2 years, hand a drawing to a stranger. He heard the word sister from lips that had been silent to the living for so long. Something inside his chest, a part of him he thought had died with Elena, began to stir. From that day forward, Kieran Thorne started coming home earlier. He stopped working until midnight. He stopped eating his meals alone in his study. He began arriving at 6 o'clock for dinner and sat at the table with Maisie and Cass. In the beginning, there was mostly silence. Kieran did not know how to talk to his daughter. Maisie was not used to her father's presence. But Cass was there, a quiet connection between them, and the awkwardness gradually faded. One evening during their meal, Maisie pointed to the window. "I see a bird," she said to Kieran. Just 3 words. But for Kieran Thorne, they were worth more than any business deal, more than any victory. His daughter had spoken to him. When he looked up, his eyes met Cass's from across the table. She gave him a small, knowing smile, as if she understood the weight of that single moment. Kieran Thorne, the cold and ruthless head of the Mafia, felt his heart skip a beat. The news moved with incredible speed. Kieran Thorne, the East Coast's most feared Mafia boss, had married an unknown waitress just 2 weeks after ending his engagement to Vivian Ashford. The tabloids ran grainy pictures of Cass entering Thorne Tower. Social media was flooded with theories. They claimed she had trapped him. They said she was carrying his child. They said everything but the truth. In a lavish penthouse on the Upper East Side, Vivian Ashford was destroying a $50,000 set of china. "That waitress!" she shrieked, throwing a vase against the wall. The sound was explosive. He picked a waitress over me. Rhett Calloway, a tall man in a dark suit, stood perfectly still in the corner, unmoved by her fury. He was accustomed to her outbursts. He knew her anger was not about rejection. It was about the failure of a 3-year plan. "Calm yourself, Tessa," Rhett said, using her real name. Vivian Ashford spun around, her green eyes blazing with danger. But she did not protest the use of her true name. In this room, there was no need for pretend. Vivian Ashford was a fiction. She was a persona invented 10 years ago, complete with perfect forgeries, a made-up family tree, and a respectable Boston lineage nobody checked. The woman in the room was Tessa Brennan, a career con artist who had already destroyed 5 wealthy men before targeting Kieran. She was not working by herself. Her employer was Salvatore Vega, Kieran Thorne's greatest enemy. The mission had been straightforward. Tessa was to marry Kieran, earn his confidence, and then leak information so Vega could dismantle the Thorne empire. Kieran's death was meant to be the final step, after his assets were in Tessa's name. But a waitress in worn-out shoes had ruined it all in a single night. The objective is the same, Rhett stated evenly. Vega still wants Thorne dead. We will simply change our method. Tessa paused among the broken porcelain, breathing heavily, but her mind was already calculating. She was no fool. She had not made it this far by letting her feelings dictate her actions. That waitress, Tessa said, her voice now cold. I want to know everything about her. Find her vulnerability. Find something we can use. Rhett simply nodded. He had already started his investigation the day before. 2 weeks later, Cass was informed she would be attending a charity gala as Mrs. Thorne. Kieran had a stylist bring dozens of designer gowns to the penthouse for her. Cass looked at her reflection in a mirror, wearing an elegant black dress that cost more than her salary for 5 months. She felt like she was looking at a stranger. At the gala, Cass felt like a minnow in a shark tank. Women adorned with jewels gave her condescending looks from behind fake smiles. Men in tailored suits sized her up with a mix of curiosity and distrust. She was an outsider, she did not fit in, and they all knew it. Kieran remained at her side for the entire evening, his hand a steady protective weight on her back. But he was often pulled away to speak with associates, leaving Cass by herself near the champagne. That is when Vivian found her. The woman came up behind her. She wore a tight red dress and had golden hair. Her smile was like sweet poison. "The new Mrs. Thorne," Vivian said. Her voice was like a knife. "Or should I call you Cassandra, the little waitress?" Cass stood her ground. She had seen worse things than a beautiful woman with a fake smile. "You can call me Cass," she said. "Let us not pretend to be friends." Vivian's head tilted. Her green eyes were sharp. "Interesting. You are playing a dangerous game. Kieran Thorne's world is no place for a fragile girl." "I have survived things you cannot imagine, Miss Ashford," Cass answered. "Do not worry about me." Vivian leaned in close. Her breath was on Cass's ear. "I know about your brother," she whispered. "Theo. At Brooklyn General. He has a surgery coming up. It would be a tragedy if something went wrong before then." Cass froze. Her blood ran cold. "If you touch Theo—" "Oh, I will not have to," Vivian said with a light laugh. She stepped back and took a sip of champagne. "I just need you to understand that you do not belong. Kieran will figure it out soon enough. And when he does, you will lose it all. Not just this pretend marriage, but also the very things you are trying to save." Then Vivian turned and disappeared into the party. She left Cass standing there, her heart pounding and her hands shaking with rage. But under the fear, a new fire started. Something was very wrong with Vivian Ashford. The way she talked, her knowledge of Theo, the way she looked at Cass. Cass knew she had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. She could not sleep after the party. She lay in the silk bed staring into the dark. She thought about Vivian's threat. She thought about Theo and everything she could lose. Around 1 in the morning, she went to the kitchen for some water. She was surprised to see Kieran there. He was sitting alone at the bar with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the sparkling city. A million dead stars. He wore a simple black shirt instead of his usual suit. The sleeves were rolled up and the collar was open. He seemed exhausted. For the first time, he looked like a normal man, not a crime boss. "Can't sleep?" Kieran's voice came from the darkness. He knew she was there. Cass paused, then took a seat near him, leaving one empty stool between them. "No. You? I haven't slept well in years." A quiet fell over them, but it was comfortable. It was the peace of two people too tired to pretend anymore. Kieran pushed a glass of whiskey toward her. She drank a little, letting the liquid burn. "What did Vivian say to you?" he asked. Cass was not surprised he knew. He knew everything. "She threatened my brother Theo. She knows he's in the hospital." Kieran's jaw hardened. "I will take care of it." "I know," Cass said, "but I need to know who she is. Something is wrong with her. Can you feel it?" Kieran was silent for a moment before he finally agreed. "I have had my own suspicions. I just have no proof." They drank their whiskey without a word until Kieran spoke again. "Elena never drank." Cass glanced at him, surprised. No one in the house ever said his late wife's name. "She preferred chamomile tea," he said, his gaze lost. "Every night she would read by the window with a fresh pot. It was how she found peace at the end of the day." He swallowed hard. "She died after Maisie was born. The doctors tried everything, but it was not enough." His voice was thick with old pain. "I was there with her. I held her hand as she died. She made me promise to look after our girl." He gave a sharp, bitter laugh. "And look at the job I did. My own daughter wouldn't talk to me for 2 years. She was terrified of me, terrified of the world." Cass stayed silent, simply listening. It was all he needed. "What about you?" Kieran asked, finally looking at her. "What is your story?" Cass stared into her glass. She never talked about the orphanage. Not from shame, but because nobody had ever bothered to ask. "St. Matthew's," she said quietly. "I was there from age 10 until I was 17. The older kids went after Theo because he was small. I had to fight to keep him safe." She showed him a thin, pale scar on her arm. "The supervisor had a favorite belt. I took the beatings meant for my brother. He locked me in the cellar once for 3 days because I stole some bread." Kieran looked from the scar to her eyes. His own cold gaze held something new. It was understanding. It was respect. And it was anger for the people who hurt her. Before he could say anything, a scream tore through the house from Maisie's room. They both ran. Maisie was trapped in a nightmare, sitting up in bed and crying out. Cass immediately pulled a linen napkin from her pocket and sat on the mattress. "Tent time," she whispered as she built their little shelter. Maisie instantly calmed down and crawled under the cloth, settling next to Cass. Kieran just stood in the doorway, lost. "Come on," Cass invited, lifting the edge of the napkin. "We have room." The most feared man on the East Coast hesitated. He was a killer who made cities quake, but he was afraid to join his daughter and his fake wife under a napkin. Then, he sat on the floor and crawled in with them. The three of them were a small island in the dark. Maisie rested her head on Cass's shoulder, and her hand gripped Kieran's finger. The darkness was safe here. "This is the most ridiculous thing I have ever done," Kieran murmured. "You will get used to it," Cass answered with a faint smile. After a moment he spoke again. "I am not sure I will ever get used to you, Cassandra." In the safety of their tent, her heart skipped. That night changed how she saw him. She no longer saw a terrifying monster. She saw a widower who did not know how to be a father. He was clumsy and flawed, but he was trying. She did not let herself think about it too much. She had a more important target: Vivian Ashford. In the weeks that followed, Cass started seeing things she had missed. She heard Vivian speaking Spanish on the phone when she believed she was alone. She saw how Vivian watched Kieran, not with affection, but with the cold eyes of a predator. She caught the secret meetings between Vivian and Rhett Calloway, the bodyguard Kieran hired 3 years ago. They stood too close. They spoke in whispers. A cold feeling always washed over her when she saw them. Cass started a journal. She wrote down dates, times, and strange conversations. She did not know what she was looking for, but her gut screamed at her. After 18 years of fighting to survive, she knew that something was deeply wrong. One night, the answer found her. Cass woke up at 2 in the morning and went for a glass of water. She saw a line of light coming from Kieran's office, but Kieran was in Chicago. He would not be home until the next day. Who was in his office? She moved silently, holding her breath, and peered through the crack in the door. Rhett Calloway stood over the desk. He was using his phone to take pictures of every single document. He was fast and efficient, like he had done it before. He photographed each page and put it back perfectly. Cass backed away without a sound, her heart hammering. She locked herself in her room, shaking. She was right. There was a traitor inside the house. And if Rhett was the mole, he had to be working for someone. The name hit her like a bolt of lightning. Vivian. The moment Kieran got home, Cass insisted they speak in private. In the library, which he swept for bugs, she told him everything. She explained her doubts about Vivian, the secret talks with Rhett, and what she saw in his office. Kieran's face remained a mask, but his hands tightened into fists. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a low threat. "I saw him myself," Cass confirmed. "He took pictures of at least 20 documents." Kieran turned his back to her and stared out the window. The silence was heavy. Cass knew he was making a plan, deciding who needed to be erased. "I want him dead now," Kieran said, his voice like ice. "If you do that, we lose our chance," Cass warned. "We will not find out who he reports to. We will never know who Vivian really is." Kieran faced her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You think like a general." "I survived hell," Cass said. "You pick things up." Kieran gave a slow nod. "So what is your proposal?" "We act like we know nothing. Let Rhett think he is completely safe. In the meantime, Declan will investigate Vivian. He needs to find out her origins, what her life was like before you, and who she works for." Kieran observed her for a long moment before a slight smile touched his lips. "You know, Cassandra, I hired a bodyguard, not a strategist." "Life has its share of surprises," Cass replied. And with that, they became partners in a war against a hidden enemy, an enemy that was waiting for the right time to attack. 2 weeks after their library meeting, Declan came back with news. Kieran had anticipated it, but the confirmation still made his jaw tighten. They met in Kieran's private office, the door shut. Declan put a single thin folder on the desk. "Vivian Ashford did not exist before 10 years ago," Declan stated flatly. "There is no birth certificate, no school records, no medical files. She has no history." The year was 2015. All of her identification, from her college diploma to her passport, are expert forgeries. The quality suggests a large organization was involved. Kieran glanced at the file. Inside, a few sheets of paper proved the woman he almost married was a ghost. "Then who is she?" Kieran asked. "We do not know," Declan answered. "But I was able to trace Rhett's activities. He sent the pictures from your office to a burner phone inside Vega's territory." That name sent a chill through the room. Salvatore Vega. He was the rival Kieran had battled for a decade. He was the man who had murdered Cassandra's father. And it appeared Vega had placed an agent inside Kieran's home for 3 years, completely undetected. "Continue the investigation," Kieran ordered. "I need her real name. I need to know what she did before she materialized, and I need to know Vega's exact plan." Declan agreed and departed. Neither man was aware that their enemy knew they were getting closer. That afternoon, Cass brought Maisie to Central Park. It was the first time the girl had been willing to leave the tower since Cass arrived. It was a small but meaningful victory. Maisie even took Cass's hand while they walked. 2 bodyguards stayed at a respectful distance, near enough to intervene but far enough to give Maisie space. They found a stone bench near a pond. Maisie sat quietly watching the ducks. Then, for the first time, Cass witnessed her smile. It was not a large smile, only a faint upturn of her lips, but it was genuine. "I like the blue duck," Maisie whispered. "I do too," Cass answered, her heart filled with warmth. They remained there for another 10 minutes. Then Cass glanced at her watch. "We should get back, Maisie. Your dad will start to worry." They got up and headed for the park exit. Everything felt normal until they stepped onto the street to get to their car. Cass heard the engines roar an instant before she saw the vehicle. A black car with no plates was speeding toward them. Cass's instincts fired before her brain caught up. She grabbed Maisie, held her close, and threw them both to the side. They landed hard on the sidewalk, just as the car flew past, missing them by less than a foot. They felt the rush of wind. Brakes squealed and people shouted. The bodyguards drew their guns and ran, but the car disappeared into the flow of traffic. Cass lay on the concrete, holding a trembling Maisie. The little girl was crying without making a sound, tears streaming down her face. It was a sad kind of progress. Maisie had learned how to handle her fear. "It is okay," Cass whispered, though she was terrified. "I am here. You are safe." One guard called Kieran while the other searched for new threats. On the cold ground, Cass understood the harsh reality. It was not an accident. It was a message. Someone knew about their investigation. Someone wanted them to know they were vulnerable. Someone wanted them to be afraid. 20 minutes later, Kieran entered the penthouse. He saw Cass and Maisie on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, and his expression softened. He knelt in front of them, checking Maisie from head to toe, then turning to Cass. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. "Just a scraped knee," Cass answered. "Maisie is not hurt." Kieran shut his eyes, holding something back. When he opened them, Cass saw an emotion she had never seen there before. It was fear, not for himself, but for them. "From now on," Kieran stated, his voice like ice, "you and Maisie do not leave Thorntower unless I am with you. This is not a suggestion, it is a command." Cass wanted to protest, to tell him she did not need his protection. But the look in his eyes, and the way he gripped her hand, made her simply nod. The war was on, and their enemy had made the first move. The following days were filled with tension. Thorntower was transformed into a fortress. The number of guards was tripled, and every entrance was watched 24 hours a day. Cass was now a prisoner in a glass castle. She did not argue because she understood, but the feeling of being trapped was suffocating. It brought back memories of being locked in the orphanage basement. Maisie seemed to pick up on the change. She stayed closer to Cass. She would not sleep by herself and asked for the napkin tent every single night. Cass always said yes. She knew that fear all too well. 1 week after the incident, near midnight, Cass heard a soft knock. She opened the door and found Kieran. He was still in his work clothes, his tie pulled loose. His hair was messy, as if he had been running his hands through it. "You are still awake?" he asked softly. "Not yet," Cass told him. "I have not been sleeping well." Kieran nodded, as if that was what he expected. "May I come in?" Cass paused for a moment, then moved aside. Kieran came into her room. It was his first time inside since she had arrived. His eyes settled on Maisie's framed drawing on the wall, the one with two people under an umbrella, protected from a dragon. "You framed it," he said, his voice holding an emotion she could not place. "It was the first present Maisie ever gave me," Cass said. "It is special." Kieran faced her. In the low light, his gray eyes were not cold anymore. They were softer, warmer, and filled with feelings he seemed unable to manage. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Really, I am fine," Cass insisted, but her voice shook. "I just cannot stop thinking about it. What if I was a second slower? What if Maisie—" She could not finish the sentence. Kieran moved closer. He reached out and gently took her hand. His own was warm and rough, but his touch was delicate. "You saved my daughter," Kieran said, his voice thick. "You used your body as a shield for her. Do you have any idea what that means to me?" Cass met his gaze. In that instant, all the barriers between them seemed to crumble. The door swung open. Maisie stood there, holding her doll, her eyes puffy from a bad dream. "Mommy," she whispered. The word hung in the air, stunning them both. "Mommy!" Maisie had called her Mommy. Cass felt a powerful ache in her chest. She pulled her hand from Kieran's, knelt down, and wiped at her tears. Cass held her arms open. Maisie scrambled to her, wrapping her small arms around Cass's neck as if terrified she would vanish. "I dreamed about the crash," Maisie whispered. "I was scared you were gone." "I am here," Cass said, the words coming on their own. "I am fine. You are safe now." She carried Maisie to her bed and they built the napkin tent together. Maisie curled up next to her and was asleep in less than 10 minutes. When Cass went back to her room, Kieran was still there. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen. It was not the stare of a mob boss or a fake husband. It was the look of a man seeing the woman he desperately wanted. "You know," Kieran said softly, "for the first time in 7 years, Maisie called someone mommy." Cass took a step back until she felt the wall behind her. "You changed everything, Kieran," he went on. "You came into our lives with a napkin and turned it all upside down. I do not know what to do about that." He stood so close she could feel his breath and see the tiny scars on his face she had missed before. "Kieran," Cass whispered, unsure of what else to say. He leaned down and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had held back for too long, who had been lonely for too long, a man who had lost so much and feared losing even more. His mouth was hot and demanding, yet beneath it was a strange desperation. For a moment of weakness, Cass kissed him back, allowing herself to feel wanted and seen. Then, reality hit her like cold water. She pushed lightly on his chest and moved away. "This is just an agreement," she said, her voice shaking. "You are paying me. I cannot do this. We cannot." "Is that really how you see this?" Kieran asked, his eyes still intense. "It is how it has to be," Cass answered, though her heart screamed no. "You lead the Mafia. The Mafia killed my father. This is complete madness." Kieran stared at her for a long time, then gave a single nod. He stepped back and left without saying another word. Cass stood alone in the dark, her lips still warm, wondering if she had just saved herself or made the biggest mistake of her life. In the 2 weeks that followed, the air between them grew tense. They made sure to never be alone. They avoided looking at each other for more than a second. But every accidental touch of their hands, every shared glance across the table, filled the room with things they would not say. Cass told herself it was for the best. "Keep your distance. This is a contract." But her heart refused to listen. Then Vivian made her move. The yearly Mafia Council Gala took place at a huge estate on Long Island. It was the most important night of the year, where bosses made deals and showed their strength. As Kieran Thorne's wife, Cass had to be there. She wore a dark blue gown a stylist had picked out. Her hair was swept up, and a diamond necklace Kieran left on her table was around her neck. She looked like a woman from high society. But inside, she was the same orphan girl in worn-out shoes, just trying to stay standing. The first 2 hours of the night were calm. Cass stood by Kieran's side, smiling politely and nodding at strangers, hiding her fear. Then Vivian appeared on the small stage, a glass of champagne in her hand, her smile as bright and dangerous as a snake's. "I am sorry to interrupt this lovely evening," Vivian said, her voice carrying through the microphone. "But I have something important to share with you all. It is about Kieran Thorne's new wife." Cass froze in place. Kieran started to move, but Vivian was quicker. "Do you know where Cassandra Marrero was living before she moved into Thorne Tower?" Vivian asked, her voice sweet like poison. "She was in an apartment owned by Harold Novak." "And who is Harold Novak?" "Well, he is just one of Salvatore Vega's most trusted men." A wave of murmurs washed over the room. People turned to stare at Cass with suspicion. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of angry faces. "She lived in that apartment for 5 years," Vivian said with dramatic flair. 5 years under Vega's watch. Then she suddenly shows up at the Gilded Serpent, gets close to Kieran's daughter, earns his trust, and marries him in a matter of weeks. Does that not seem a little too perfect? Vivian turned and looked directly at Cass, her green eyes like chips of ice. "You are a spy, Cassandra Marrero. Vega planted you here to destroy Kieran Thorne from the inside, and I have the proof." She held up a folder and tossed it onto the floor in front of Cass. papers scattered everywhere. There were pictures of Cass's old apartment, files on Novak, records of Novak's reports to Vega. "That is not true!" Cass cried out, her voice breaking. "I do not know who Novak is. I was just renting from him. I do not know anything about Vega." But nobody was listening. The room was thick with suspicion. Even Declan was watching her carefully, his hand on his weapon. Cass looked to Kieran, desperate to find trust in his eyes, for someone to believe her. He stood there with no expression, his gray eyes impossible to read. In that second, Cass felt her heart break into pieces. "Kieran," she whispered. He did not reply. He just looked at her for a long moment, then turned to Declan. "Find Novak. Bring him to the basement. Now." Then he walked away, leaving Cass to face the whispers and stares all by herself. She had never been so utterly alone. 3 hours later, in the basement of Thorn Tower, Harold Novak was on his knees, blood dripping from his face onto the concrete. Kieran stood over him with his sleeves rolled up, his own forearms splattered with blood. Declan watched from the corner. "I will ask you one last time," Kieran said, his voice cold as steel. "Did she know?" Novak coughed up blood and trembled. "No, she knew nothing. I swear it. Vega just told me to watch her after she left the orphanage. I was supposed to report on her life, to make sure she stayed in the city. She never knew." "Why did Vega care so much about her?" Kieran demanded. Novak paused. Kieran hit him again. "Why?" "Because of her father," Novak yelled. "Thomas Maroro. He was the police officer building the case against Vega 18 years ago. Vega had him killed but could not find the evidence. He thought Maroro hid it somewhere, and that his daughter might lead him to it, so he watched her entire life." Kieran froze. Cass had been watched for 18 years and had no idea. Her life was not a series of random events. It was a game, and she had never known she was a pawn on the board. "She is innocent," Kieran stated. It was not a question. It was a fact. Innocent. Novak nodded his head over and over. "She is just a girl trying to get by. She knows nothing about Vega, or me, or any of it." Kieran turned and stormed out of the basement. He had to find Cass. He had to tell her that he believed her, that everything would be okay. But when he got to her room, the door was open and she was gone. He found her in Maisie's room, curled in a corner, holding the sleeping child, while silent tears streamed down her face. He knelt in front of her. "I know the truth," Kieran said softly. "You are innocent. You have been a victim your whole life." Cass looked up, her eyes swollen and red. "My whole life," she whispered. "It was all a lie. I thought I was free. I never was." Kieran took her hand in his. "I will burn Vega's world to ash for what he did to you. I swear it." After that night, Kieran's protection of Cass became intense. He doubled her security, refused to let her leave alone, and spent more time at home. But one meeting was unavoidable. The Council of Bosses called for an urgent meeting in Chicago to talk about Vivian's claims and the future of their alliance. If Kieran did not show up, it would be seen as an admission of guilt. He had to go. The morning he was leaving, Kieran stood in Maisie's doorway, watching Cass read a story to her. Cass looked up and saw the worry deep in his gray eyes. "I will be back as soon as I can," Kieran said. "Declan is staying here with you and Maisie. Do not leave the penthouse for any reason." Cass nodded. "We will be fine." Kieran paused, then walked over and kissed Maisie on the forehead. The little girl smiled and hugged his neck. Then he looked at Cass, and for a second, she thought he might kiss her too, but he only squeezed her shoulder gently before walking away. She watched the elevator doors close, a heavy feeling of dread settling in her chest. That evening felt normal. Cass gave Maisie dinner, read to her, and they built their usual towel tent. Maisie was asleep by 8, holding her small cloth doll. Cass sat by the bed for a while, listening to the child's soft breathing before going to her own room. She did not know that her final moments of peace were ending. At 10 that night, The security system in Thorn Tower went dark. The lights flickered out. The cameras died. The electronic locks clicked open. It all happened in 3 seconds. Cass was reading when the darkness hit. She leaped out of bed, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. She ran for Maisie's room, but the elevator doors slid open before she could get there. 5 men dressed in black with their faces covered poured into the penthouse. Behind them was Vivian, wearing a dress the color of blood and a cruel smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Thorne," Vivian said. "Or maybe I should just call you Cassandra, the little orphan girl." Cass backed away, her eyes darting around for a weapon. "How did you get in here?" Vivian laughed. "You can thank Rhett for that. He has been working for us all along. He shut down the whole system and took care of Kieran's loyal men. Long sleep. Declan is the only issue, but he is occupied in the basement with a couple of bodies." Cass felt her heart stop. Not Declan. 2 men grabbed her. She fought back, kicking and scratching, but they were stronger. They gagged her and tied her hands. "The child," Vivian said, gesturing toward Maisie's room. "No! No!" Cass screamed against the gag, struggling helplessly as a man went into the room and dragged Maisie out. The terrified girl woke up screaming, a sharp sound that cut through the silence. She fought him, but he just held her tighter. "Make it stop," Vivian hissed. "That noise is awful." She took out a syringe and threw it to Rhett, who appeared from the darkness with a cruel smile. "Put her to sleep. I cannot take the sound." Rhett moved toward Maisie with the needle. Cass fought harder, trying to yell a warning. She could not let them harm Maisie. She could not. "Wait," Vivian ordered, waving him to a halt. She stood in front of Cass, her eyes filled with a sick pleasure. "You know, Cassandra, I have been waiting for this. For 3 years. 3 years of pretending to be Kieran Thorne's loving girlfriend, just waiting to destroy him. Then you showed up and ruined everything with a simple napkin." She seized Cass's chin, her nails digging in. "But it does not matter. The plan changes a little. Instead of marrying Kieran, I will use you and the girl to make him give me everything. Then Vega will kill him. As for you," she looked thoughtful, "your death will be slow. I will see to it myself." She stood straight and gestured. "Take them. And Rhett, if the girl does not quiet down, use the syringe. I do not care." They were pulled into the elevator, taken to the garage, and thrown into a van. Maisie was still screaming for Cass, but they were kept apart. Cass could only watch her through tears, trying to send a silent promise. "I am here. You will be okay. I will protect you even if it kills me." For almost an hour, the van tore through the darkness. When it stopped, they were pulled out and shoved into a deserted warehouse. The air was cold and damp, lit by a few dim yellow lights. Maisie was no longer screaming. She was just a small body shaking with a violent tremor. Her eyes were vacant, lost in a place Cass recognized as deep shock. Vivian's voice cut through the quiet. "Tie the girl to that chair, and keep an eye on the waitress." They secured Maisie to an old wooden chair. She was limp like a doll, staring at nothing. Cass was thrown onto the floor nearby, her hands still bound. Vivian sat down and made a call. "Kieran Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with victory. "I have your wife and daughter. If you want them back alive, you know the price." She ended the call and smiled. "Now, we wait. We will see if your husband loves you enough to sacrifice his empire." Cass met Maisie's empty gaze and made a silent promise to get her out of there, no matter what it took. Time stretched into a long, formless nightmare. Cass had no idea if they had been there for 1 hour or 3. She only knew that she had to do something soon. She scanned the room, absorbing every detail. It seemed to be an old factory office. A large wooden table stood in a corner, holding several bottles of liquor and a heavy ashtray made of crystal. A silver Zippo lighter rested beside them. Against the far wall was an old brass telescope, likely a forgotten decoration. Vivian was in the corner, talking on her phone about money transfers. Rhett was on guard, holding a gun, but his attention was on his own phone. Another man stood by the only door. Cass looked at Maisie. The child was still, but her eyes were different now. She was looking right at Cass with complete trust. Maisie was waiting for her to act. Cass knew she could not let her down. For the past few hours, Cass had been secretly rubbing the ropes on her wrists against a sharp piece of metal on the floor. The fibers were wearing thin. She knew one strong pull would break them, but she had to wait for the right moment. She glanced at the table near Maisie and gave a small nod. Underneath it, Cass had seen a little red button. It looked like an old emergency alarm for the factory. If it still functioned, it could set off sprinklers, or at least make enough noise to create a diversion. Maisie's eyes followed her gaze, found the button, and she gave a tiny nod back. She understood. Vivian finished her call and approached them, smiling. Good news! Kieran has agreed to everything. He is on his way to sign over his entire empire for you two. She leaned close to Cass. He really does love you. How pathetic. Love is for the weak. Then Vivian turned to Rhett. Get ready. When Kieran gets here, shoot him first. Then finish these two. No! Cass screamed, pulling her arms apart with all her strength. The rope snapped. She launched herself toward the table, snatched a bottle, and tossed it high into the air over Rhett's head. He instinctively looked up, distracted for just a moment. It was all the time Cass needed. She grabbed the heavy crystal ashtray and threw it with perfect aim. It flew through the air and shattered the bottle in a shower of glass. Strong liquor rained down, soaking Rhett from his hair to his chest. Cass seized the Zippo, sparked it, and threw it. The flame touched the alcohol, and Rhett became a human torch. He screamed, dropping his gun as he clawed at his burning face. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air. Now, Maisie! Cass yelled. Maisie did not wait. She slid from the chair, dove under the table, and pushed the red button with all the force her 7-year-old body could manage. A piercing alarm began to wail. Sprinklers roared to life, spraying water everywhere. The guard at the door panicked and ran. Vivian shrieked with fury and dove for the gun on the floor. Cass charged and they slammed into each other on the wet concrete. They rolled on the slick floor, punching and scratching. Vivian was surprisingly strong, fueled by a furious hatred. She grabbed Cass's hair, pulled her head back, and then pinned her down. Her hands closed around Cass's throat. You worthless waitress, Vivian screamed, her face a mask of rage. I had it all. I was supposed to be a queen. You ruined everything. Cass fought for air. She clawed at Vivian's hands, but the grip was too strong. Her vision started to fade. Lights flickered at the edge of her sight. She was dying. Then, a small shape appeared behind Vivian. It was Maisie. The little girl was holding the heavy brass telescope in both hands. Her face was streaked with water and tears, but her eyes were hard. She did not make a sound. She just swung the telescope with all her might. A loud clang echoed through the warehouse. The metal struck the back of Vivian's head with brutal force. Vivian's eyes rolled back in her head. Her grip went slack. She collapsed unconscious. Cass gasped, dragging painful breaths into her lungs. Each breath felt like fire, but she was alive. Maisie let the telescope fall to the floor with a clatter. She looked at her own trembling hands, as if she could not process what they had just done. Cass crawled to her and pulled her into a tight embrace. She took out the linen napkin she carried everywhere, the one from their first night at the restaurant, and draped it over both of them. Time for a tent, Cass whispered, her voice raw. Under the soaked cloth, with the alarm still screaming and the smell of smoke in the air, Maisie buried her face in Cass's chest and began to sob. I was so scared, Mom. I know, Cass cried with her. Me too. But you were so brave. You saved my life. They stayed like that, huddled under a wet napkin, waiting for rescue. Suddenly, gunshots erupted outside. One shot, then two more, followed by silence. Cass clutched Maisie even tighter, her heart pounding. She did not know if the men belonged to Vega or to Kieran. She only knew she had to protect this child. The warehouse door crashed open. Cass braced herself for the worst. Then she heard his voice. Cass. Maisie. It was Kieran. She peeked from under the cloth and saw him in the doorway. He held a gun, and his shirt was stained with blood. His gray eyes scanned the room with the fierce intensity of an animal searching for its family. Declan and more guards rushed in behind him, securing the groaning Rhett and checking on the unconscious Vivian. But Kieran's gaze never left the corner where the two figures were hiding. He ran to them and dropped to his knees, gently pulling the cloth away. Maisie looked up at him, her eyes red. "Dad," she whispered, before throwing herself into his arms. He held her tightly, as if he was afraid she would disappear. Tears ran freely down his face. For the first time in many years, the cold Mafia boss was crying. Then his eyes found Cass. She just sat there, her throat covered in bruises and her hair a tangled, wet mess. But she was alive. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Cass tried to speak, but no words came out. She just nodded as her own tears began to fall. Kieran gathered her and Maisie into his arms, holding them both. The three of them clung to each other in the middle of the wreckage. Cass lifted the wet napkin and draped it over all of them, making their small tent in hell. "Time for a tent," she whispered. Kieran gave a broken laugh through his tears. "You are completely insane, you know that?" "I told you," Cass replied with a weary smile. "I have survived hell before. I can survive anything." Maisie looked up. "I hit the demon lady," she said with pride, "with the long tube." Kieran glanced at Vivian, then at the brass telescope on the floor, and back at his daughter with astonishment. "My daughter knocked out Vivian Ashford with a telescope," he said, shaking his head. "You saved Mom," Maisie said simply. Kieran looked at Cass, his eyes saying everything he could not. Love, relief, and a silent vow that this would never happen again. "It is finally over," Kieran said, holding the two most important people in his world. And there, under a damp cloth in the middle of chaos, Cass let herself believe him. The criminal world does not use public courts or defense attorneys. It has its own law, enforced in a dark room beneath an abandoned hotel. This is where the Council of Bosses met to decide the fate of Vivian Ashford, or as they now knew her, Tessa Brennan. She was brought before them in handcuffs, a bruise on her face from Maisie's telescope. The arrogance was gone from her green eyes, replaced by pure terror. She finally understood there was no escape. The evidence was presented: the false identity, the ties to Vega, the kidnapping, the conspiracy to commit murder. Each charge was like another nail hammered into her coffin. Vivian pleaded and tried to blame others, but her words were useless. Betrayal was the one sin that had no forgiveness in their world. The council's vote was unanimous. Tessa Brennan, her real name, was stripped of her wealth and marked a traitor. She was forced out of the country with a simple promise: if she ever came back, she would die. They flew her to Brazil and left her with only the clothes she was wearing. 10 months later, a news story reported a woman named Tessa Brennan was arrested in Sao Paulo. She had conned a rich businessman and earned a sentence of 25 years in a brutal prison. Justice finds a way. Rhett Calloway was not as lucky. His injuries from that night were too great. He died in a hospital 3 days later, revealing nothing. But Kieran no longer needed him to talk. 2 weeks after Vivian's exile, Kieran called his inner circle. This was a declaration of war. Salvatore Vega had toyed with Kieran for the last time. He had sent a spy into Kieran's own home. He had put a target on his wife and daughter. He was the man who had murdered Cassandra's father 18 years ago. The game was over. They struck on a night with no moon. Kieran led the charge with Declan and 50 of his best men. They hit Vega's fortress in New Jersey, a mansion that everyone thought was untouchable. They were wrong. The fight was over in 45 minutes. Blood and bullets filled the air. But as the sun came up, Kieran Thorne was the one left standing. Salvatore Vega was dead at his feet. He had 3 bullets in his chest, just like Thomas Marrow all those years ago. Justice. Cass was at home with Maisie, sick with worry. When Kieran walked in the next morning, his clothes were stained with blood, and his face was bruised, but he was alive. She threw her arms around him. "It is finished," Kieran said, his voice full of exhaustion and relief. "Vega is dead. Vega is—" "Your father is avenged," Cass just held on. The tears she had held back for 18 years finally streamed down her face. She wept for her mother and father, and for the 10-year-old girl who had lost her whole world. But she also cried because someone had finally delivered justice for her family. Later that morning, Kieran gave Cass a worn ledger. He told her they had found Marcus Webb in a town on the coast. Every one of the $80,000 he had stolen was recovered. Kieran's voice was cold and final, making it clear that the last threat from her past was gone. 1 week later, Kieran called the council together. He was not there for their judgment, but for a declaration. "I am getting out of all illegal operations," he announced to the most powerful men on the coast. "The Thorne Empire will become a legitimate business. Real estate, investments, charity, no more drugs, no more guns, and no more killing." Absolute silence fell over the room. A few of the men exchanged doubtful looks. An older member stood, his face flushed with anger. "Thorne, you cannot do this," he protested. "You will make all of us weak." "I can," Kieran said, his voice like steel. "And I will. Those who support this will stay and work with me. Those who do not can leave this room now." He scanned the faces before him, his gray eyes full of menace. "But do not forget that Vega also believed he could oppose me." No one said a word. No one left their seat. And that is how Kieran Thorne started to build a new legacy, not with violence, but with good choices for the people he loved. 2 months had passed since Vega was killed. It was 2 months of a peace Cass had never known in her 28 years of life. There were no more dangers hiding in the dark. No more enemies tracking her. Vivian was in a prison in Brazil. Vega was dead. Thorn Tower finally felt like a real home, which was exactly why Cass knew she had to leave. In her room, she folded her clothes into a small, open suitcase. She did not pack the expensive clothing Kieran had given her. She only packed what she had arrived with, her old clothes and the worn linen napkin. She also packed the first picture Maisie had drawn for her, the one showing 2 stick people holding an umbrella over a dragon. The contract was done. In fact, it had been over for a long time. 6 months had passed, double the original agreement, and Cass had no reason left to be there. The threat was gone. Kieran did not need a fake wife anymore. Maisie had improved so much and could have a real tutor, someone with degrees and experience, not an orphan with just a GED. She had to go. She knew if she stayed another day, she would never find the strength to leave. Declan said, "You called for a car service." Kieran's voice from the doorway made Cass jump. She turned and saw him leaning there, his gray eyes watching her with an unreadable expression. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He appeared tired but also more at ease than she had ever seen him, like a great burden had been removed. "It is time, Kieran," Cass said. She tried to keep her voice even as her heart pounded. "The danger is gone. You do not need a bodyguard. You can find a qualified tutor for Maisie." "Not you," Kieran interrupted, stepping into the room. "Not the woman who saved my daughter at the restaurant. Not the woman who taught her how to trust people again. Not the woman who shielded her with her own body from a speeding car. Not the woman who fought Vivian with only a bottle to protect her." Cass turned from him, unable to look him in the eye. "It was just a business arrangement. You needed stability. I needed money for Theo. The contract is finished." "The contract was for 6 months," Kieran said, moving closer. "You have been here nearly a year." "I have stayed too long," Cass said as she reached for her suitcase. "I will go to Queen's. I will get my nursing degree. It is what is best." She tried to get past him, but Kieran blocked her way. He took the suitcase from her and set it down. "I have dissolved the old council," he told her suddenly. Cass froze in surprise. "What?" she asked. "The ones who cared only for appearances? The ones who saw Maisie as something to be hidden away?" "I removed them. I am rebuilding everything. Everything will be legal and clean, and I want to focus on what really matters." He pulled a folded paper out of his pocket. "Maisie drew this for you this morning." Cass took it with shaking hands. The crayon drawing was clumsy, but it broke her heart. 3 stick figures stood together. The tallest had short black hair, a shorter one had long black hair, and the smallest had curly black hair. They were all under a large blue umbrella, but above it was a bright yellow sun instead of a dragon. Underneath, in the handwriting of an 8-year-old, Maisie had written one word: family. Tears streamed down Cass's cheeks. "Kieran, I cannot. People will talk. They will call me a gold digger like Vivian. They will say a waitress trapped the boss." "Let them talk," Kieran said. He stepped closer and held her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "I do not care about the world, Cass. I only know this house felt empty before you arrived. I only know my daughter did not call anyone mom for 7 years, until she met you. I only know that when I wake up, the first thing I want to see is you." His voice dropped, thick with feelings he had held inside for so long. "If you leave, all the light in this house will go with you, Cass, and I do not think I can live in the dark again." Cass looked into his gray eyes. They were no longer cold and cruel, but filled with honesty and longing. She thought about all the reasons she should go. She thought about their pasts and what people would say. Then she thought of Maisie calling her mom, and the nights in their towel tent, and the safety she felt with Kieran. She thought about the home that was finally ready to be hers. "I do not want the light to go out," she whispered. Kieran leaned down and kissed her. It was not a rushed kiss. It was slow and deep, full of promises. It was the kiss of a man offering his whole heart. When they pulled apart, their foreheads touching, Kieran whispered, "Do not go. Stay with me, with Maisie, with our family." Cass looked at the drawing in her hand, at the 3 figures under the umbrella, and she knew her answer. "Okay," she breathed out. "I will stay." 5 years later, the cover of Forbes magazine read, "A New Legacy, Kieran and Cassandra Thorne, Transform Autism Advocacy." Below the title was a picture of a family of 3 standing before a new therapy center, smiling and holding hands. But Cass was not looking at the magazine. She was on the balcony of their vacation home in the Hamptons. She watched the blue ocean glitter under the sun and listened to the waves. Her life had changed completely in 5 years. She and Kieran had married in a small ceremony. 3 years ago, she had officially adopted Maisie, making their family legal in the eyes of the law. She also started the Morrow Thorne Foundation, a charity that supported children with sensory disorders and other conditions. The door behind her opened. A 12-year-old girl walked out, wearing headphones and a big smile. Maisie had grown so much. She still had hard days when the world was too much and she needed her towel tent. But she had learned to manage her challenges and turn them into strengths. "I got into the STEM program, Mom," Maisie said, holding out a letter. "They say I have a gift for coding." Cass beamed and hugged her daughter. "I knew you could do it. You are my little genius." "Dad is crying in the kitchen," Maisie added in her usual flat tone. "He is pretending to make pancakes, but I saw him." Cass laughed and went inside. In the kitchen, Kieran was awkwardly flipping pancakes while trying to hide his tears. He had changed so much in 5 years. He was still a powerful man, but his coldness was gone, replaced by warmth. His gray eyes, once dark, now lit up when he looked at his wife and daughter. At the counter, Theo was sneaking blueberries. He was healthy and happy. The surgery 5 years ago had been a total success. Now, he had a degree in software engineering and worked for a big tech company. He had his own apartment, but he came home every weekend. He came back to the sister who had sacrificed everything for him. Kieran saw Cass and smiled a smile that was only for her. She got in, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Our daughter is in the STEM program. I know, Cass said, wrapping her arms around his waist. I am so proud of her. And I am proud of you, Kieran said. He turned and kissed her softly. I still owe you for the cashmere sweater you ruined on our first night, he murmured, remembering that night long ago. Put it on my tab, Cass said with a smile. Winked. Maisie walked in and saw her parents embracing, then pretended to be grossed out. Can you two please stop? I am 12 years old. The whole family laughed. This was the life they had made together. It was not built on perfection, but on quiet understanding. It was not held up by big promises, but by small moments of being there for each other. They had discovered that love is not always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes, love is just sitting in silence under a napkin until you feel safe again. The waitress in the worn shoes did more than serve a mob boss his dinner. She saved him. He saved her. And from the wreckage of their pasts, they built a new family. This is how a simple act of kindness, a moment of courage, and a napkin changed 3 lives. It is a story that reminds us to never look down on the person pouring our coffee, because they might just be the strongest person we will ever meet. It teaches that family is not always about blood. It is about the people who stand with you when the world is too much to handle. And most of all, it shows that no matter how broken your past is, there is always a chance for a better tomorrow. All it takes is being brave enough to open our hearts and trust. If this story of love, forgiveness, and family touched you, please like and share this video with the people you care about. Remember to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you do not miss more powerful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Has there ever been a time in your life when one small, kind act made all the difference? Or has someone come into your life like Cass did for Kieran and Maisie, bringing light where there was only darkness? We invite you to share in the comments below. We would be honored to hear the real stories that have moved your soul. Thank you so much for watching with us from start to finish. We wish all of you good health, a life full of joy, and days filled with peace. Always remember that even when life is hard, people care about you, and you deserve to be loved. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons.